Okay, so those who then explain what has not been stated and uttered by the Tathagata as having been stated and uttered by him, and then saying that what has been stated and uttered by the Tathagata has not been stated and uttered by him. Okay, and this, I have to say, this pair of statements becomes a bit problematic, controversial, even that can lead to polemical debates, because we have bodies of literature both in the Theravada tradition and the Mahayana tradition in which there are sutras which are said to have been spoken by the Buddha, and yet, on the basis of historical scholarship, we can determine certainly that they don't come from the period in which the Buddha himself was alive. And I know on the basis of this, some rather, say, strict and doctrinaire Theravadins then dismiss the whole body of Mahayana sutras and say, this is all distortion of the true Dhamma. This was not spoken by the Buddha himself. And therefore we have to regard it as a body of literature that's contributing to the decline and disappearance of the Dharma. And I have to confess, when I was a good, very orthodox young monk in Sri Lanka, that was my view. But over time, I've come to take a much wider view of the Dharma. And I see, and one point that I find to be very interesting and perplexing is that if we look at the early discourses, that is in the Pali Canon and in other comparable collections like the Chinese Agamas, we don't find any teaching on the Bodhisattva path and practice or the Bodhisattva ideal. And yet, if we then adhere to a very strict historical point of view, then we'd have to say, okay, this whole idea of a Bodhisattva ideal, Bodhisattva path, Bodhisattva practice, all of this is later development, not something spoken by the Buddha himself. And yet, in the Pali Sutta, even in the Pali Suttas, the Buddha appears to me clearly as being on a different level, even from his most advanced Arahat disciples. Like he's regarded as the one who, without any teacher, without any guidance, has arrived at the supreme perfect enlightenment. He's the one who brings the light of the Dharma into the world. He is the one who is able to teach extensively and to direct the teaching to the needs and capacities of the people being instructed. And so it would seem to me that there would be some people in the Buddha's audience who would recognize the distinctiveness of the Buddha and then would form the aspiration to achieve Buddhahood itself. Particularly, even in the early discourses, we find the idea that Buddhas arise from time to time, separated by long periods of time. So one would think that there would be some people who would be inspired by the example of the Buddha and take the Buddha himself as the model, the ideal, and then come to the Buddha and say, Bhante, I aspire to follow your path as a bodhisattva. What are the instructions appropriate for me? So one would expect to find discourses like that, but we don't find anything like that in the Pali Canon, or probably in the Chinese Agamas. So doesn't that seem to, it seems to me to be almost like a glaring absence. And then the Mahayana Sutras provide those instructions. And so I don't see them, if the Mahayana Sutras were to say, like, these are the requisites for achieving arhatship, and then teach them differently from the teachings that are given in the Pali Canon, then we would say that this is a distortion of the teaching. But the Mahayana Sutras are based on a different ideal, different spiritual ideal, and so a different model of the Buddha's path. And so I don't see them to be in essential conflict with the Pali Suttas. Though I have to say that there are things in the Mahayana Sutras that I would put very bold question marks around. But I think that there's a way, to look at the difference between them and to encompass both. Okay, that's my opinion. Maybe there'll be some people who disagree with me, particularly as this goes up on YouTube, and then there'll be maybe a lot of very critical remarks that Bhikkhu Bodhi has sold out his Theravadan heritage. But, and this is another point, even within the Theravada tradition, we find whole bodies of literature which are ascribed to the Buddha, which probably on historical grounds can be regarded as of later origin. So within the living Theravada tradition, do you know what the ABC of the Theravada tradition is? A stands for a work called the Upadana. This is a text in the Sutta Pitaka which narrates the past life deeds of merit and past life practices of the great disciples or the Arahat disciples of the Buddha. So in collections of poems, both the monks and the nuns relate what were the deeds and practices that they undertook in their previous lives that served as the supporting conditions for them to achieve arhatship under the Buddha. So that is the A of the Theravada tradition. The B, what is the B of the Theravada tradition? Anybody know? There's a work called the Buddha Vangsa. The Buddha Vangsa, the work means, the name means the Chronicle of Buddhas. And this is a short work which begins with the story, a story that's common to all the Buddhist traditions, about how the Buddha Gautama in a past life, aeons and aeons ago, was an ascetic by the name of Sumedha. And in that life, he met a Buddha, the 24th Buddha going back in cosmic time. He met a Buddha named Dipankara. And he was so impressed by the Buddha Dipankara that he bowed down at the Buddha Dipankara's feet, and in his mind, he made the vow or aspiration to achieve Buddhahood in the future. In other words, at that time, he generated the bodhicitta, the aspiration for Buddhahood. And then the Buddha Dipankara looked down at him, at this ascetic Sumedha, and gave the prediction or the prophecy that after so many aeons, this ascetic will become a Buddha named Gautama and teach the Dhamma for the benefit of devas and human beings. And then the Buddha Vangsa relates the stories about the 23 other Buddhas and how the Bodhisattva Gautama, who has become the Buddha Gautama, met those Buddhas and made the vow or continually renewed his vow or aspiration to achieve Buddhahood and received the predictions from those Buddhas. So in many of the Buddhist temples in Sri Lanka, this is a standard motif one will find on the wall of the Buddha Hall, a series of panels which will show the 24 past Buddhas and the Buddha, the one who is the Bodhisattva who is to become the Buddha Gautama, forming his aspiration at the feet of those Buddhas. So that is the B of the Buddhist, Theravada Buddhist, popular Buddhism in the Theravada countries. The C of popular Buddhism, what is the C? It's a work called the Charya Pitaka. The Charya Pitaka relates, it's a series of Jataka stories in which the future Buddha Gautama, as a bodhisattva, fulfilled each of the 10 paramitas. And so those are the works that form the basis for so much of the sermons and discourses and devotional practices in Theravada countries. And yet they're, by scholars, they're all regarded as being, we call apocryphal. That means that they're of later origin, but inserted into the canon. And then the D of the Theravada tradition is the Dhammapada, which of course it's canonical and probably a lot of it stems from the Buddha himself. But when monks are explaining the Dhammapada, they will rely on the Dhammapada commentaries, which contain stories from the life of the Buddha, which, whether they're true or not, we don't know, but they're certainly, or probably a lot of them are of later origin. Okay, we skip over E, F, G, H, I. Then we come to the J of the Theravada tradition. What is the J? Certainly you know that. What is it? Right, the Jatakas. So the Jatakas are stories about the past lives of the Buddha Gautama when he was maybe an elephant king, or could be a merchant, could have been a king himself, a human king, a prince, a bird, the head of a flock, the chief of a flock of birds, a monkey king, an ascetic in the forest, a tree spirit, many, many different past lives. And they're all, the Jatakas are supposed to illustrate how the Buddha fulfilled certain good qualities. Though sometimes many of the Jatakas really serve more either have primarily entertainment value or else simple ethical value, conveying a simple ethical message. And yet it's said that all of these stories were related by the Buddha himself. So I just want to show that the Buddhist tradition, I would say that the Buddhist tradition becomes richer by the variety of its teachings and literature. And so if we remove the Jataka stories and the Buddha Vangsa account, I'd say that the Buddhist tradition becomes impoverished. We lose this, and the Dhammapada stories, then we lose this very vast, instructive, and sometimes inspiring body of narrative literature.